Two armies fought for land, but two institutions fought for something far greater, the human soul. The Wehrmacht and the NKVD were mirror images of obedience and terror, each convinced that fear could forge purity. What happens when faith and control become indistinguishable, and victory means inheriting the very evil you tried to destroy? The origins of the confrontation between the Wehrmacht and the NKVD lay not in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa, but in the deeper logic of two totalitarian states preparing for an ideological collision they both considered inevitable. By the summer of 1941, Germany and the Soviet Union were bound not by treaties, but by the knowledge that each viewed the other as the embodiment of an existential threat. The Wehrmacht advanced under the banner of a crusade against Bolshevism, while the NKVD stood as the ultimate guardian of Stalin's regime, responsible not only for internal control, but for enforcing political reliability across the front. Their clash represented more than a military encounter. It was a collision of systems in which political power and armed force were indistinguishable. The background to this confrontation reached back to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939. That agreement, which temporarily aligned Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. For 2 years, both powers occupied their respective zones with ruthless efficiency. The NKVD oversaw the annexation of the Baltic states, the deportation of hundreds of thousands of Poles, and the mass executions at Katyn. Meanwhile, the Wehrmacht conquered western Poland and prepared for the westward campaign against France. Both systems learned from each other's methods. The German Sicherheitsdienst studied Soviet deportation tactics, while Soviet internal troops observed the Wehrmacht's mobilization speed and organizational discipline. The alliance of convenience masked mutual contempt and meticulous preparation for its eventual collapse. By early 1941, intelligence reports from both sides revealed growing tension. The Abwehr, under Admiral Canaris, estimated Soviet divisions at the western frontier to number over 150, while the Red Army General Staff suspected Germany of deploying more than 100 divisions along the Bug and Niemen rivers. Both assessments proved correct. The NKVD border troops, numbering approximately 170,000 men, were reinforced in secret orders by March, instructed to maintain readiness for possible provocations. On the German side, preparations for Barbarossa included directives to the SS and the Army High Command, specifying the special role of security forces in occupied territories. The NKVD's mirror image would soon confront its German equivalent, the Einsatzgruppen. When the German invasion began on June 22, 1941, the NKVD found itself simultaneously as frontline defenders, rear area police, and executioners of Stalin's own panic. In the first 48 hours, German aircraft targeted NKVD command posts and prisons across western Ukraine and Belarus, anticipating that these would serve as hubs of resistance. In many cases, they were. NKVD units, such as the 132nd Border Regiment near Brest and the 90th Regiment in the Pripyat marshes, fought isolated actions against vastly superior forces. Outnumbered 10-1, they delayed the Wehrmacht's advance by hours or days, buying time for regular army formations to regroup. German officers were surprised by the intensity of their resistance, mistaking these paramilitary troops for regular soldiers. Yet within days, as the front collapsed, NKVD personnel shifted to a more familiar role, maintaining control behind Soviet lines through arrests, executions, and forced deportations of civilians accused of defeatism. The ideological divide between the two forces shaped their conduct from the outset. For the Wehrmacht, the enemy represented the ultimate dehumanized adversary, a political class rather than an army. For the NKVD, the invader embodied a direct threat to the party and its monopoly on loyalty. Each side viewed the other as an agent of annihilation, and both acted accordingly. German orders, such as the Commissar Directive, June 6, 1941, authorized the immediate execution of captured political officers who were presumed to be NKVD operatives. Soviet countermeasures, formalized in Stalin's Order No. 270, August 6. These mirror image decrees institutionalized the moral framework of total war. By midsummer, the overlapping jurisdictions of the Wehrmacht, SS, and NKVD created an escalating cycle of reprisals. German forces executing NKVD prisoners cited their participation in political killings during the Soviet retreat. In turn, NKVD units destroyed prison populations in Lvov, Minsk, and Ternopil before withdrawing. Over 20,000 detainees executed in less than 2 weeks. For both regimes, control was inseparable from terror. Civilians trapped between them experienced this not as ideology, but as survival. The moment one flag was lowered and another raised, loyalty was redefined, and life or death followed accordingly. By the time the Wehrmacht reached Smolensk in July 1941, the contours of this hidden war within the larger invasion were already visible. In July 1941, Stalin signed directives transferring thousands of NKVD officers to the newly created partisan units operating behind German lines. These formations, initially small and poorly equipped, focused on sabotage of supply routes, intelligence gathering, and assassinations of local administrators who cooperated with the occupiers. The most effective networks combined local knowledge with NKVD coordination, particularly in Belarus, where nearly 70% of partisan groups were founded by security officers. The German response was swift and brutal. Army Group Center implemented Bandenbekämpfung operations, anti-partisan campaigns that treated entire villages as hostile territory. The interaction between the Wehrmacht and the NKVD, the Germans distributed leaflets urging Red Army soldiers to defect, promising humane treatment and freedom from the NKVD's tyranny. Soviet loudspeaker units broadcast counter-messages, warning that surrender meant certain death under the Gestapo. The battlefield became a psychological experiment in total control, with fear as its primary weapon. German units executed captured commissars and NKVD men on the spot, while Soviet internal troops arrested entire battalions accused of retreating without orders. In some sectors, particularly near Smolensk and Mogilev, captured NKVD officers were interrogated by the Abwehr and the Einsatzgruppen. The Germans sought to understand the organization's structure and methods, seeing in it a distorted reflection of their own security system. Reports from Einsatzgruppe B in August 1941 described the NKVD as the state within the state, responsible for political indoctrination, executions, and population control. Ironically, this description mirrored the SS's own role in occupied Europe. Both sides functioned on the same principle, the belief that political reliability outweighed military competence. The NKVD's operations in retreating zones demonstrated a similar duality of purpose. Even as its combat regiments fought alongside regular troops, its special departments, Osobie Odeli, monitored the Red Army for signs of defeatism. Between July and October 1941, these departments arrested more than 650,000 soldiers for desertion or cowardice. Of those, over 10,000 were executed by firing squads positioned behind the front. The system of control that Stalin had perfected during the Great Purge now extended directly into the trenches. The same officers responsible for mass deportations in peacetime now commanded the blocking detachments that enforced loyalty through fear. For the Wehrmacht, contact with the German officers saw in their Soviet counterparts confirmation of the ideological war Hitler had predicted, a struggle not merely against armies, but against an entire worldview. Orders from the High Command emphasized the extermination of commissars, political agents, and Jews, fusing racial doctrine with the fear of Soviet political indoctrination. The NKVD, in turn, identified the Wehrmacht not as a conventional army, but as an arm of genocide. This mutual dehumanization left no room for conventions of warfare. Captured NKVD men were executed. Captured Germans accused of espionage met the same fate in Soviet custody. By late 1941, as German forces reached the gates of Moscow, both systems were fully mobilized in their respective doctrines of terror. The NKVD directed Simultaneously, the Einsatzgruppen, operating in close coordination with the Wehrmacht, carried out systematic executions of Jews, political officers, and alleged partisans. Each side claimed moral justification. Each saw itself as defending civilization against barbarism. In truth, their confrontation marked the moment when the Eastern Front ceased to be a war between armies and became a war for control over the human soul, a conflict in which obedience itself became the ultimate weapon. By the winter of 1941, the collision between the Wehrmacht and the NKVD had evolved beyond isolated encounters and punitive actions. It had become a structured, deliberate campaign of mutual annihilation. Both institutions represented the ideological cores of their respective regimes, and both sought to destroy not just the other's soldiers, but the political and moral framework that sustained them. The Wehrmacht's advance into Soviet territory coincided with a growing reliance on the SS and the Einsatzgruppen to execute political orders, while Stalin's NKVD took on the dual task of defending Moscow and purging those deemed insufficiently loyal within the collapsing front. Each side's actions reflected a shared belief that the war was not about territory, but about the right to define truth itself. As German forces approached Moscow in October 1941, the NKVD was mobilized to its full capacity. Internal troops were deployed to reinforce the city's outer defensive lines, while the 2nd Motorized NKVD Division was assigned to secure key bridges, communication centers, and the rear areas of the Red Army. At the same time, NKVD special departments intensified their surveillance of military units, arresting thousands accused of defeatism or spreading panic. Reports from the front indicated that, between October and December, over 3,500 Soviet soldiers were executed for retreating without orders, many by their own political officers. The discipline of the Red Army was maintained through fear, and the NKVD stood as both shield and sword of the state. The Wehrmacht, meanwhile, faced its first major strategic failure. The advance on Moscow faltered in the face of supply shortages, worsening weather, and stubborn Soviet resistance. Yet German command documents reveal that the obsession with political warfare persisted even as the offensive stalled. Field Marshal von Bock's staff noted the need to cleanse the rear of Soviet remnants, referring to NKVD detachments, commissars, and partisan cells operating behind German lines. The Einsatzgruppen and order police units expanded their operations accordingly. In just 4 months, Einsatzgruppe B, operating in Belarus and Western Russia, reported the execution of over 130,000 individuals categorized as Jews, commissars, and NKVD personnel. These figures demonstrate how the Wehrmacht's military objectives were inseparable from its ideological ones: to destroy the machinery of Soviet control by exterminating its perceived human embodiment. For the NKVD, the collapse of the front created both opportunity and crisis. Its forces were among the last to retreat, often charged with destroying infrastructure and archives to prevent their capture. In Smolensk, NKVD demolition teams obliterated communications hubs and fuel depots as German armor closed in. Thousands of civilians were evacuated eastward under NKVD supervision, though many perished during forced marches in freezing conditions. In cities like Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk, the organization implemented scorched earth orders. Factories were dismantled, bridges destroyed, and suspected collaborators executed before withdrawal. These tactics delayed the Wehrmacht's logistics, but left vast humanitarian devastation in their wake. The NKVD measured success not in lives preserved, but in control maintained. The German occupation that followed introduced its own apparatus of domination, which in many respects mirrored the NKVD's methods. Civilian administrations were subordinated to the Reichskommissariate, while the Geheime Feldpolizei and Sicherheitsdienst established interrogation centers in former NKVD prisons. The same cells that had held Soviet dissidents now contained captured partisans, Jews, and political suspects. In places like Minsk and Kiev, the continuity of repression was almost seamless. The uniforms and insignia changed, but for the local population, survival meant adapting to whichever authority occupied their city at a given time. Collaboration, resistance, and neutrality became indistinguishable lines within a single landscape of coercion. On both sides, the relationship between ideology and violence deepened through repetition. The NKVD's logic of political reliability demanded proof of loyalty through action, while the Wehrmacht's doctrine of racial and ideological purity required constant demonstrations of ruthlessness. At Vyazma, captured Soviet officers were interrogated about the NKVD's structure. When they refused to cooperate, they were executed and their bodies left as warnings. In response, NKVD counterintelligence circulated directives reminding troops that surrender was not an option. Families of those taken prisoner were to be stripped of rations and exiled to Siberia. The front line had become not only a military barrier, but a psychological one, a zone where ideology policed the boundaries of existence. By early 1942, both the NKVD and the Wehrmacht had institutionalized their respective systems of control. The NKVD reformed its structure to include the main directorate for the protection of the rear, responsible for securing railways, supply routes, and communication lines against German sabotage. It also continued to supervise the Gulag labor camps, which swelled with new prisoners from occupied territories. The Wehrmacht, in turn, issued new directives expanding the powers of its security divisions. These units, often composed of older reservists, were tasked with maintaining order in conquered regions through executions, deportations, and forced labor conscription. The result was a symmetry of repression. In human terms, the confrontation between the NKVD and the Wehrmacht represented the fusion of military and political violence into a single, self-sustaining process. Each institution saw itself as the custodian of civilization, and the other as the embodiment of barbarism. The NKVD's defense of the state was inseparable from its role in mass repression. The Wehrmacht's campaign of conquest was inseparable from its complicity in genocide. Between them lay millions of civilians whose survival depended on navigating the moral geography of total war, where loyalty was fluid, morality conditional, and mercy a liability. By the spring of 1942, as German forces prepared for their renewed summer offensive, the ideological war had already consumed entire regions. Villages burned, populations vanished, and the line between soldier and executioner blurred irreversibly. The NKVD's banner of state preservation and the Wehrmacht's promise of liberation both concealed the same fundamental truth. This was not merely a struggle for dominance of territory, but for control over conscience itself, a war in which obedience had become the highest virtue and humanity the ultimate casualty. The spring and summer of 1942 marked a period of transformation for both the Wehrmacht and the NKVD. What had begun as a military campaign had by then evolved into a total system of ideological warfare, where every action, whether military, administrative, or punitive, served a political end. The Wehrmacht, still confident after its victories in the Crimea and Kharkiv, prepared to resume the offensive toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad. The NKVD, reorganized and hardened by the disasters of 1941, assumed an even more central role in Stalin's war effort. It became not only the enforcer of discipline and internal order, but also the manager of intelligence, logistics, and propaganda. The two institutions were mirror images. Both saw control as salvation and dissent as treason. Their confrontation deepened into an invisible war within the larger conflict, fought through arrests, executions, and the destruction of populations deemed politically unreliable. In the Soviet rear, the NKVD's reach extended across every sphere of life. The main Directorate for Counterintelligence, SMERSH, Death to Spies, was established in 1942 to monitor the Red Army and intercept German agents behind the front. This new structure reflected Stalin's obsession with internal security. SMERSH units screened soldiers returning from encirclements, conducted interrogations, and executed those suspected of collaboration or cowardice. Between May and December of 1942, official reports list more than 15,000 executions carried out under Articles 58 and 193 of the Soviet Criminal Code, primarily for desertion, espionage, or panic spreading. The NKVD's methods of control, surveillance, fear, and relentless punishment ensured the cohesion of a society at war, but at the cost of immense psychological damage. Soldiers fought not only the Germans ahead of them, but the commissars behind them. On the German side, the invasion's second year brought the full integration of ideological warfare into the command system. The Wehrmacht security divisions, operating under the Army High Command, but in coordination with the SS, conducted so-called cleansing operations in newly occupied territories. In Ukraine, German archives from Army Group South record over 200,000 people executed between April and October 1942 in anti-partisan campaigns, though contemporary analysis suggests that less than 10% were actual combatants. The Wehrmacht's insistence on rear area security became a euphemism for the systematic eradication of political resistance and ethnic minorities. The NKVD's partisan war mirrored this brutality. Deep behind German lines, NKVD-directed sabotage groups destroyed railway bridges, telegraph lines, and fuel depots. Their operations were supported by intelligence from local populations, though cooperation was often coerced. German reprisals were immediate and devastating. Entire villages were wiped out for harboring partisans. The NKVD calculated these losses as the acceptable cost of maintaining pressure on the occupiers. Their reports to Moscow emphasized the number of trains derailed, enemy casualties inflicted, and collaborators executed, but rarely mentioned the tens of thousands of civilians caught in the crossfire. In Belarus alone, German Bandenbekämpfung operations and Soviet sabotage combined to kill over 350,000 civilians by the end of 1942. In occupied regions, the NKVD's image became complex. For those under German rule, the NKVD was both the distant arm of liberation and the ghost of past terror. Its returning agents were feared almost as much as the Wehrmacht itself. When Soviet forces retook areas such as Kaluga and Rzhev, NKVD special departments immediately conducted purges of local populations. Those who had worked under German administration were branded as traitors, regardless of motive. In the Smolensk region alone, over 12,000 people were arrested during the first 6 months of reoccupation. Many said the NKVD's ideology permitted no neutrality. Survival under occupation was equated with collaboration. Meanwhile, the Wehrmacht's war of extermination deepened its dependence on psychological conditioning. The belief that the Soviet Union represented a subhuman threat was reinforced by constant propaganda. Soldiers were encouraged to see NKVD men as the embodiment of Bolshevik cruelty. Leaflets distributed to frontline troops described captured NKVD officers as fanatics who shoot their own, and the living proof of the East's barbarism. The effect was to normalize atrocities. Interrogations routinely ended in executions. POWs suspected of belonging to the NKVD were shot immediately. Their bodies left as warnings. The chain of command tolerated, even encouraged, such acts. Reports from the 6th Army during the advance toward Stalingrad mentioned dozens of instances where political elements among prisoners were eliminated on the spot under the Commissar order. The NKVD's response to the German advance towards Stalingrad was ruthless and efficient. As the front lines narrowed, internal troops were assigned to organize the city's defense, build fortifications, and prevent desertion. The 10th NKVD Division, composed largely of internal security personnel, fought alongside regular infantry in street battles, often suffering catastrophic losses. Between August and November 1942, NKVD units in Stalingrad recorded over 15,000 enemy kills, but also executed 13,500 Soviet soldiers for unauthorized withdrawal. Blocking detachments were stationed at key intersections and river crossings to prevent retreats across the Volga. Official records from the Stalingrad front confirm that 1,218 soldiers were executed within the first 10 days of the city's siege alone. The NKVD's authority was absolute. Its purpose was not only to repel the enemy, but to ensure that the Red Army... In the Wehrmacht, the fear of NKVD reprisals was matched by its own system of coercion. Field police and Gestapo units operating near the front arrested German soldiers accused of defeatism, spreading rumors, or sympathy with the enemy. Over 22,000 Wehrmacht personnel were executed for disciplinary offenses during the war, an unacknowledged symmetry with their Soviet counterparts. Both sides maintained order through violence, both measured loyalty by obedience, and both demanded the suppression of doubt as a condition of survival. By the end of 1942, the confrontation between the NKVD and the Wehrmacht had reached its most intense phase. The Red Army's defense at Stalingrad and the German obsession with ideological annihilation transformed the front into a laboratory of totalitarian control. Each regime used its security apparatus to enforce faith, one in racial destiny, the other in historical necessity. Between them lay millions of civilians who understood that neither side fought for liberation, but for domination. In the ruins of Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht and the NKVD stood as mirror reflections of the same principle, that terror, when systematized, could become a form of order. The winter of 1942-1943 marked the turning point not only of the Eastern Front, but of the ideological confrontation that defined it. The Battle of Stalingrad was the moment when the two totalitarian systems, the Wehrmacht and the NKVD, each acting as the armed conscience of its regime, collided at their full capacity. The struggle for the city transcended strategy or geography. It became an experiment in absolute control, fought on both sides not only with weapons, but with fear, surveillance, and indoctrination. The Wehrmacht sought to annihilate the Soviet state by destroying its symbol of endurance, while the NKVD... Between them, Stalingrad became the theater of a moral and political siege unparalleled in modern warfare. By late November 1942, the German Sixth Army had encircled much of Stalingrad, but faced a Soviet counteroffensive that would reverse its fortunes. As the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, the NKVD assumed command over all internal operations in the city, enforcing the defense of every block and factory. The 10th and 230th NKVD divisions, backed by special departments, manned defensive positions and directed executions of deserters or those attempting to cross the Volga without orders. In December alone, official records list 1,218 executions by internal troops on the Stalingrad front and over 4,000 arrests for defeatism. The NKVD's presence ensured that Soviet soldiers fought as much from fear of retribution as from conviction. Every retreating step required Inside the German encirclement, the Wehrmacht mirrored this descent into total discipline. Hitler's Führer Directive No. 47, issued on December 22, 1942, forbade any surrender or breakout attempt without personal authorization. Army commanders who suggested retreat were dismissed or arrested. Military police and Gestapo liaison officers within the Sixth Army documented desertions, executed looters, and suppressed defeatist talk. The ideological component of German command had reached its final stage. Obedience equaled virtue, and sacrifice equaled salvation. As rations dwindled and temperatures fell below 30 degrees Celsius, soldiers were told that holding Stalingrad was not only a duty, but an act of faith in the destiny of the Reich. Meanwhile, the NKVD's operations extended far beyond the front. In the territories liberated by Soviet counteroffensives, NKVD special groups began the process of cleansing. Anyone who had worked under German occupation, administrators, police, interpreters, even medical staff, was subject to investigation. Between December 1942 and March 1943, in the Voronezh and Orel regions alone, over 40,000 people were arrested, and an estimated 10,000 executed without trial. These actions, justified as protection against espionage, re-established Stalin's monopoly on power in recaptured zones. To the NKVD, the front was not merely a battlefield, but a moving boundary of loyalty, a line that redefined friend and enemy each time it shifted westward. The Wehrmacht's reaction to the NKVD's resurgence was one of paranoia and vengeance. German propaganda portrayed NKVD agents as the embodiment of Bolshevik cruelty, broadcasting exaggerated reports of executions and deportations in retaken territories. The Sixth Army's war diaries, recovered after the war, contain multiple references to NKVD terror groups, allegedly executing their own civilians. In response, the Wehrmacht intensified its cooperation with the Einsatzgruppen and Feldgendarmerie, targeting partisans, Jews, and suspected Soviet agents across occupied Ukraine. During January 1943, more than 30,000 civilians were killed in anti-partisan operations in Volhynia and around Kharkiv, numbers that exceeded the actual partisan presence in those regions. The result was not control, but chaos, as German forces lost moral and strategic cohesion while trying to enforce ideological order. When the Sixth Army finally surrendered on February 2, 1943, the NKVD was among the first Soviet institutions to enter the city. Its agents immediately began classifying prisoners, interrogating officers, and separating ordinary soldiers from political criminals. Of the approximately 90,000 German prisoners taken at Stalingrad, around 2,000 were identified as members of the SS or security police and executed on the spot. The remainder were marched eastward to NKVD-controlled camps, where nearly two-thirds would die within months due to starvation, disease, and exposure. The Soviet victory, celebrated as a triumph of endurance, thus began with a new cycle of imprisonment. For the NKVD, the surrender of the Wehrmacht was not merely a military success, but a validation of its doctrine, that absolute authority, sustained through terror, could defeat even the most formidable enemy. Yet Stalingrad also revealed the limits of both systems. For the first time, NKVD reports to Moscow contained references to moral fatigue and loss of ideological clarity among troops. The sheer magnitude of destruction, over 1 million Soviet casualties, made it difficult to frame victory as redemption. Similarly, German officers began to question the ideological logic of a campaign that demanded annihilation over survival. Letters intercepted by Soviet intelligence described despair rather than fanaticism. "We are no longer soldiers," one German wrote. "We are prisoners of ideas that have already died." In the months that followed, both institutions adapted to the new strategic reality. The Wehrmacht retreated under increasing Soviet pressure, while the NKVD expanded its presence in all liberated territories. Smersh intensified counterintelligence operations, uncovering hundreds of supposed enemy agents within the Red Army itself. Each Soviet advance westward was accompanied by a wave of purges designed to eliminate collaboration. The pattern established at Stalingrad, military success followed by political cleansing, became the model for the rest of the war. By mid-1943, the balance of power on the Eastern Front had shifted irreversibly. The Wehrmacht, still powerful but bleeding from attrition, now fought a defensive war. The NKVD, stronger than ever, had become the backbone of Stalin's wartime state. What began as an internal police force had evolved into a central organ of the war effort, controlling populations, securing logistics, managing prisoners, and dictating political orthodoxy across millions of square kilometers. The city that bore the Soviet leader's name symbolized not only the turning point of the war, but the victory of the apparatus over the individual. In Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht and the NKVD had fought not just for territory, but for the definition of loyalty itself, and both had proven that in their respective systems, loyalty was measured only in obedience and blood. The aftermath of Stalingrad in 1943 reshaped the nature of the confrontation between the Wehrmacht and the NKVD. The German army, forced into strategic retreat, carried the psychological weight of its first undeniable defeat, while the NKVD emerged as one of the central pillars of Stalin's expanding wartime empire. The balance of terror that had characterized the first years of the war did not disappear. It shifted. As the Wehrmacht retreated westward and the Red Army advanced, the NKVD followed closely behind, turning each liberated region into a laboratory of political purification. Both sides, though on opposite trajectories, were united by the same imperative: to maintain control in the face of collapse. For the Wehrmacht, 1943 was a year of defensive improvisation. Its structure, stretched over thousands of kilometers, now depended heavily on rear areas. The need to stabilize the front after Stalingrad forced German command to delegate authority to the SS and the Sicherheitsdienst, who took responsibility for rooting out partisans and Bolshevik remnants. In practice, this meant systematic massacres across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic region. German documents from the Army Group South archives record over 12,000 anti-partisan operations between March and December 1943, most targeting civilians accused of aiding Soviet partisans or NKVD agents. These reports listed more than 400,000 dead, though field intelligence later confirmed that only a fraction had direct ties to armed resistance. The Wehrmacht's logistical weakness translated into ideological excess. As it lost ground militarily, it sought to reassert moral control through violence. The NKVD, advancing behind the Red Army, viewed the same territories through the lens of suspicion. In Ukraine, the NKVD's filtration commissions screened returning soldiers, refugees, and civilians. Out of 1.2 million individuals processed in 1943, more than 180,000 were arrested, and 50,000 sent to Gulag labor camps. The purpose of these measures was not only to identify collaborators, but to reimpose the authority of the state. The NKVD's doctrine assumed that loyalty could not exist without supervision. As Soviet troops liberated Kharkiv in August 1943, NKVD special departments executed over 3,000 people accused of assisting the occupier, many on the basis of denunciations made under duress. Liberation thus carried the same instruments of fear that occupation had imposed. The Wehrmacht's encounters with NKVD-directed partisans intensified as the front lines contracted. The summer of 1943 saw the launch of Operation Zigeunerbaron in Belarus, a massive German counterinsurgency involved. Its stated goal was the elimination of partisan units, but German records showed that only 6,000 armed combatants were killed compared to 25,000 civilians. Among the captured were NKVD liaisons embedded with partisan formations, who were interrogated and executed on the spot. In retaliation, NKVD partisans ambushed German supply trains and assassinated local mayors appointed by the occupation authorities. Villages such as Katyn and Ozerici were annihilated in collective reprisals, acts that exemplified how both systems justified mass murder as preventive security. Within the Red Army itself, the NKVD's presence was omnipresent. SMERSH officers attended staff meetings, monitored communications, and reported directly to Stalin. Between January and September 1943, SMERSH investigated 278,000 soldiers for anti-Soviet behavior. Over 12,000 were executed, while tens of thousands were. These formations were ordered into the most dangerous sectors of battle, often clearing minefields or charging fortified positions unarmed. In Soviet propaganda, they were portrayed as redeemed heroes, but NKVD records reveal that they were rarely acknowledged after death. The system used sacrifice as atonement and terror as discipline. As the Wehrmacht's losses mounted, the ideological certainty that had sustained it began to fracture. Reports from the Eastern Front described declining morale and growing distrust between regular officers and SS personnel. Wehrmacht commanders complained that SS units operated beyond their control, executing civilians indiscriminately and thereby fueling partisan resistance. At the same time, NKVD reports intercepted from German prisoners revealed a growing disbelief in Nazi propaganda. One captured major, interrogated near Belgorod, confessed, "We were told you would burn us alive, but your men are like ours, tired, afraid, and bound by orders." Yet neither side's leadership allowed such realizations to change the course of the war. Both states continued to define humanity through obedience. The NKVD's influence extended deep into Soviet industrial and logistical systems. As the Red Army advanced, the reconstruction of railroads, factories, and communication lines was supervised by NKVD engineering units. Labor came from Gulag prisoners, over 1.5 million by late 1943, many of whom were political detainees arrested during the very purges that had once crippled the Army's command structure. The circular logic of Stalin's state was complete. The same apparatus that punished failure provided the manpower for victory. Reports from the main directorate of camps, Gulag, boasted of delivering 900,000 tons of coal, 400,000 cubic meters of timber, and 30,000 rail cars to the front within a single year. Victory was being built by the condemned. In the occupied territories, the Wehrmacht faced a paradox similar to the NKVD's. The more it relied on repression, the more resistance it provoked. German commanders recognized that mass killings undermined order, but had no alternative tools of governance. The Kommissarbefehl, the order mandating the execution of political officers, remained in effect even as some generals privately opposed it. In the field, ideological warfare persisted out of inertia. German propaganda continued to present the conflict as a crusade against Asiatic Bolshevism, even as logistical collapse made its fulfillment impossible. By the end of 1943, the front had moved west of the Dnieper. But the shadow war between the NKVD and the German security apparatus only intensified. Each retreating step for Germany, and each advancing mile for the USSR, carried with it reprisals, purges, and deportations. Civilians, trapped between the two systems, became the true battleground. In a single year, more than 1.3 million non-combatants were executed, deported, or imprisoned across the occupied East. Both sides justified their actions in identical terms: security, order, loyalty. Yet beneath the bureaucratic language lay the same pursuit of control through fear. The Wehrmacht and the NKVD, born of different ideologies, had converged in practice. Both had become machines designed not merely to wage war, but to regulate belief. The year closed with both systems entrenched in their respective certainties. The Wehrmacht prepared. What neither could yet see was that their methods, surveillance, executions, and the obliteration of individual will, would outlive the war itself. The confrontation between them was no longer just military. It had become a reflection of 20th century civilization's most defining truth. That power, once fused with ideology, consumes even those who wield it. By early 1944, the Eastern Front had become a vast, shifting front of retribution. The Wehrmacht was retreating across landscapes it had once claimed as its empire's eastern frontier, while the NKVD followed in the wake of Soviet advances, reconstructing an order defined not by liberation, but by obedience. Both sides were now fighting wars within wars: military, ideological, and psychological. The physical front line moved westward, but the invisible line of control, enforced through fear and indoctrination, remained constant. In German command circles, the defeat at Kursk in July 1943, the Wehrmacht's leadership, bound to Hitler's absolute directives, could no longer act as a professional army. Instead, it had become the executor of a political fantasy. The Führerprinzip, the belief that all decisions must flow from the leader, reduced strategic flexibility to ritualized obedience. Officers who questioned orders risked execution or transfer to penal units. German field reports from the spring of 1944 reveal the growing presence of Gestapo and SS political commissars embedded with army headquarters, mirroring the Soviet system they had once condemned. The transformation was complete. The Wehrmacht had become a military apparatus policing its own faith. Meanwhile, the NKVD's dominance within the Soviet war machine reached unprecedented heights. Smersh units, formally established in April 1943, operated under the personal authority of Stalin. Their jurisdiction extended over every front, army, and division. Their mission: to ensure the absolute loyalty of personnel to the motherland and to the Supreme Command. In practice, this meant surveillance without limits. Each Red Army formation included a special department officer whose task was to monitor morale, intercept dissent, and control information flow. Soldiers who criticized orders, spoke of surrender, or even discussed rumors of German victories could be arrested within hours. In 1944 alone, Smersh arrested over 270,000 individuals, including 12,500 officers. The majority were not spies or traitors, but victims of exhaustion, fear, or careless speech. The NKVD's omnipresence ensured discipline, but at the cost of trust. The Wehrmacht's struggle to maintain order was no less ruthless. Facing collapse on multiple fronts, it turned to Volksdeutsche militias, Cossack collaborators, and police regiments to hold territory. In Ukraine and Belarus, many were former Soviet citizens, often NKVD defectors, now serving under German command. The resulting conflicts blurred all distinctions between occupier and occupied. NKVD reports describe entire villages changing allegiance multiple times within months, each shift followed by purges from the new authority. In March 1944, in the Polessia region, German records document the execution of 2,000 villagers as NKVD sympathizers, while Soviet reports from the same district record over 1,500 executions of German collaborators within the same period. The local population, trapped between these powers, ceased to be citizens and became subjects of suspicion. As Soviet forces liberated more territory, the NKVD began to reorganize society itself. Committees for the restoration of state authority were established under NKVD supervision in every recaptured district. Their purpose was twofold: to restore economic production and to identify socially dangerous elements. This category was deliberately broad. It included anyone who had worked under German administration, accepted food rations, or even possessed German printed identification papers. Between January and October 1944, NKVD tribunals processed more than 900,000 such cases, leading to 120,000 executions and over 400,000 deportations to Siberia or Central Asia. The official Soviet narrative described these actions as necessary to cleanse the rear of enemy remnants. In reality, they reimposed Stalin's pre-war system of total surveillance, ensuring that the victory advancing westward would not weaken central authority. Within the Wehrmacht, desperation. Soldiers were told that they were defending not only Germany, but the entire Western world from Asiatic chaos. Nazi publications such as Signal and Die Wehrmacht began framing the NKVD as the embodiment of a demonic enemy, a secret police that enslaved nations through terror and deceit. Yet this rhetoric only emphasized the irony. The Wehrmacht itself had become dependent on its own instruments of repression. In 1944, over 20,000 German soldiers were executed for desertion, defeatism, or disobedience, figures closely comparable to those recorded by the NKVD within the Red Army. The ideological mirror was perfect. Both systems punished disbelief as treason. Partisan warfare during this period blurred all moral and strategic boundaries. Soviet partisans, often commanded by NKVD officers, conducted widespread sabotage against German infrastructure, destroying bridges, railways, and German counterinsurgency operations, particularly Operation Frühling and Operation Cormoran in Belarus and Poland, claimed tens of thousands of lives. In retaliation, NKVD units targeted suspected collaborators in newly liberated areas, executing local police forces and their families. Each act of repression justified the next, creating a continuous chain of vengeance. By mid-1944, the civilian death toll across the Eastern Front's rear zones exceeded 2 million. In western Ukraine, the NKVD confronted a new challenge: nationalist resistance movements. The Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, initially anti-German, now turned against Soviet rule. The NKVD labeled them fascist remnants and launched extensive operations to annihilate them. Between July, German intelligence intercepted these reports, using them in propaganda to portray the Red Army as an oppressor of its own people. Yet the Wehrmacht's withdrawal from Ukraine left behind scorched earth and destroyed cities, making Soviet authority appear, by comparison, as the only functional power. As the Red Army entered Poland, the NKVD's task expanded into foreign territory. The establishment of the Polish Committee of National Liberation in Lublin marked the beginning of Soviet control through proxy institutions. NKVD advisors oversaw the creation of local security organs, precursors to the post-war Polish secret police. The system of coercion that had governed the USSR was now exported beyond its borders. Each liberated capital became the foundation for a new sphere of influence, secured not by tanks alone, but by informants, tribunals, and prisons. For the Wehrmacht, the retreat became a pilgrimage of despair. Soldiers who had once believed in victory now fought to delay inevitable defeat. Reports from Army Group Center describe entire divisions reduced to shadows, starving, frostbitten, and hunted by partisans. The NKVD's advance units captured thousands of prisoners daily, feeding an ever-growing network of filtration camps. Many were never identified by name. For both institutions, human lives had become administrative entries, columns in ledgers measuring efficiency in death. By the end of 1944, the war between the Wehrmacht and the NKVD had transcended its political origins. It was no longer about territory or ideology, but about the perpetuation of control. Each side, convinced of its moral mission, had absorbed the methods of its adversary. The Wehrmacht enforced loyalty through terror. The NKVD secured victory through fear. Between them lay a continent of ruins, proof that when two totalitarian systems confront one another, the boundary between faith and coercion dissolves completely. By January 1945, the Eastern Front had ceased to resemble a battlefield in the traditional sense. It had become a wasteland of collapsing regimes and advancing armies, where the Wehrmacht and the NKVD, the two most disciplined institutions of their respective empires, now stood as the last functioning instruments of control amid the chaos. The Wehrmacht, fighting for a state that was disintegrating, and the NKVD, enforcing the will of a state expanding into new territories, had both transformed into systems whose primary purpose was to maintain obedience, not victory. The German military front, stretched thin from the Baltic to the Carpathians, was collapsing under the weight of the Soviet winter offensives. Operation Bagration in mid-1944 had already annihilated Army Group Center, and now the Red Army's advance was measured not in kilometers, but in days. The NKVD's special departments, attached to every Soviet army, had become the logistical backbone of this advance. Their tasks included securing captured infrastructure, screening prisoners, and organizing local administrations in occupied Poland, the Baltics, and Eastern Prussia. Within weeks of entering Poland, NKVD operational groups established hundreds of detention centers. Between August 1944 and February 1945, over 80,000 people were arrested in Poland alone, former collaborators, members of the Home Army, and anyone suspected of nationalist deviation. For Moscow, the liberation of Eastern Europe was inseparable from the extension of internal discipline. In East Prussia, the Wehrmacht faced the full brutality of a Soviet state bent on vengeance. The German civilian population, numbering over 2 million, fled before the advancing Red Army. NKVD rear units followed the troops, tasked with maintaining order but often contributing to the chaos. The same reports document mass looting and assaults by Soviet soldiers, followed by NKVD disciplinary measures that punished hundreds of perpetrators, yet did little to restore control. For Stalin's state, conquest had merged with retribution. The NKVD's presence ensured that vengeance did not disrupt the broader machinery of domination. The Wehrmacht's situation mirrored its opponent's contradictions. Hitler's orders demanded total resistance, no retreat, no surrender, no negotiation. Yet the military structure had disintegrated. Commanders operated without coherent lines of communication, supply, or reinforcement. Gestapo and SS detachments executed soldiers attempting to flee westward. Between January and April 1945, official German records list more than 20,000 executions for desertion. At the same time, thousands more were killed in spontaneous field courts organized by junior officers. In territories retaken by the Red Army, the NKVD undertook one of its most massive wartime operations, the filtration of millions of returning Soviet citizens. Prisoners of war, forced laborers, and evacuees were all treated as potential traitors. By March 1945, NKVD filtration camps held over 1.5 million people. Of these, roughly 600,000 were cleared and released, 400,000 were assigned to penal labor, and 200,000 were sentenced to long-term imprisonment for anti-Soviet activity. Those figures, based on official reports to Beria, reveal the bureaucratic precision of suspicion. Every individual had to prove innocence. Loyalty was not presumed, but certified through paperwork, interrogation, and surveillance. The NKVD intercepts of German communications show the psychological toll, messages filled with despair, directives unreadable due to chaotic encryption, and units reporting no command, no ammunition, but still fighting. In the ruins of Königsberg and Danzig, the NKVD documented cases of German civilians forming militias, armed with hunting rifles and agricultural tools, defending their towns against Soviet troops. Many were killed without record, as both armies consumed their own populations in the name of endurance. Inside the Soviet command structure, the NKVD's authority expanded even further. Beria's network managed deportations of entire ethnic groups accused of collaboration. Between February and May 1945, the Crimean Tatars, Chechens, Ingush, and Volga Germans, totaling nearly 2 million people, were relocated under NKVD supervision to Central Asia and Siberia. Thousands died en route. Official orders describe these as preventive security measures to eliminate the risk of rebellion behind advancing fronts. The policy demonstrated the NKVD's transformation from a national security organ into a continental instrument of population engineering. As Soviet troops pushed into Germany, the ideological roles of both institutions converged in their extremity. German propaganda, now broadcasting from bunkers, invoked the image of the NKVD as a symbol of barbarism, warning citizens that surrender meant annihilation. Soviet propaganda, meanwhile, depicted the Wehrmacht as the embodiment of fascist evil, justifying every atrocity as retribution. The NKVD's own films and newsreels showed captured German officers confessing to crimes before their execution, a spectacle of justice that erased the line between legality and vengeance. Both sides fought less for the future than for the preservation of their own myths. The human cost of this. In just 4 months, from January to April 1945, the Eastern Front witnessed over 4 million military casualties and at least 2 million civilian deaths. NKVD archives record 700,000 German prisoners taken in that period, of whom 1/3 perished during transport or in early captivity. Simultaneously, German police and SS units massacred tens of thousands of prisoners during forced evacuations from camps in occupied Poland. The confrontation between the Wehrmacht and the NKVD had evolved beyond war. It had become a contest of annihilation between two bureaucracies that viewed death as an instrument of order. When the Red Army finally reached Berlin in late April 1945, NKVD detachments followed immediately behind combat troops, securing ministries, archives, and key infrastructure. Their mission was to collect intelligence, arrest Nazi officials, and prevent looting by Soviet soldiers. The collapse of the Third Reich in May 1945 did not end the confrontation between the Wehrmacht's remnants and the NKVD, it transformed it. As the guns fell silent, the battlefield shifted from open warfare to occupation, interrogation, and control. Across Central and Eastern Europe, millions of soldiers and civilians now came under the authority of the Soviet security apparatus. The NKVD, once the hidden instrument of repression, became the visible face of the new order. Meanwhile, the scattered remnants of the Wehrmacht, caught between surrender and survival, struggled to reconcile their defeat with the world they had helped destroy. The battle for the soul did not end in victory. It evolved into a campaign of judgment and memory. The Soviet advance left an enormous human residue. Between May and August 1945, NKVD operational groups processed more than 3.5 million German prisoners of war. In the camps of Tambov, Vyatka, and Orenki, thousands of officers were compelled to write memoirs, military analyses, and denunciations of the Nazi regime. These documents, collected by the NKVD's Special Archive, served dual purposes: intelligence for Soviet historians and ideological proof of the USSR's moral victory. But the men who wrote them were broken by exhaustion, disease, and hunger. For many, survival required confession. For others, silence became their final act of defiance. Inside the Soviet Union, the NKVD's wartime power reached its zenith. Lavrenti Beria's agency now oversaw not only internal security, but also the reconstruction of the empire. Entire ministries, industry, transport, and communications depended on NKVD labor camps. The line between justice and vengeance blurred entirely. In East Berlin, the NKVD established the notorious Speziallager Nr. 3 in Hohenschönhausen, where interrogations and disappearances continued into the early 1950s. The liberation of Germany had become the imposition of a new system of control, one that inherited the administrative rigor of the Old Reich while reversing its ideological polarity. Among ordinary Germans, the experience of occupation varied between gratitude and terror. The Soviet command encouraged public denunciations of former Nazis, resulting in a wave of retribution that consumed entire communities. NKVD field reports from Saxony and Thuringia mention over 50,000 denunciations filed within 3 months of occupation. Some were motivated by ideology, others by personal revenge. In this atmosphere, guilt became a social currency. Both organizations inherited the same obsession with surveillance, documentation, and ideological conformity. The systems that had once destroyed each other on the battlefield now coexisted within the same political geography, divided by an iron curtain but united by method. By 1947, the Cold War had begun, and the confrontation between the NKVD's successors and the West replaced the open clash of armies. Yet beneath the new geopolitics lay the same unresolved moral question: could a society built on coercion ever truly know peace? The ruins of Berlin, Warsaw, and Kiev stood as silent witnesses to that dilemma. The Wehrmacht had perished in its attempt to dominate through faith in destiny. The NKVD had survived by mastering the art of domination itself. Their encounter had defined the 20th century's darkest moment, a war not for territory or ideology, but for the right to command the human soul. The legacy of the struggle between the Wehrmacht and the NKVD extended far beyond the end of the Second World War. What began as a clash between armies became, in the decades that followed, a conflict of memory, secrecy, and ideology, a battle to define truth itself. Both institutions, though one destroyed and the other transformed, left behind systems that reshaped Europe's political and moral landscape. The ruins of cities were rebuilt, but the psychological foundations of fear, obedience, and control remained intact, embedded into the new world that emerged from the ashes. In the immediate aftermath of 1945, the NKVD's authority reached across continents. Its agents not only governed Soviet territory, but directed the formation of security services throughout Eastern Europe. In Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and East Germany, new ministries of internal affairs modeled themselves directly on the NKVD structure.